Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really pleased to have with me once again Richard Maybury. He is the publisher of U.S. and World Early Warning Report for investors. It's an excellent newsletter. It's one that I've been subscribing to for many years now. earlywarningreport.com. Go there to sign up for Richard's newsletter. It's a very reasonably priced newsletter, and also an excellent publication, The End of Washington as Superpower, a special report that you can purchase there as well. And as I was mentioning in my introductory remarks, Richard is really unique in that he brings probably, well, I guess as anybody I know, I don't know of anybody that knows history, including all of the history teachers I've ever had in college and high school. I don't know of anybody that knows history better than Richard does. Real history. I mean, actual factual history, not contrived stuff from the state, but real actual history. And the combination of that, along with an understanding of how human beings really act and what they really need to live in peace with one another, makes Richard very unique. And I think his newsletter is so worth the price, and I would just suggest to all of my listeners that you might want to consider subscribing to Early Warning Report. Go there, earlywarningreport.com. Thanks for joining me again, Richard.
Well, thank you, Jay. And incidentally, while we're talking about newsletters, I was reading one of yours the other day, and it occurred to me that this is the best written newsletter I've ever seen. You do research that is so much more in-depth than anything I've run across before. And I would like to, just for the audience to know that I've been writing newsletters and reading them for something like 40 years, and I've never come across the depth like your newsletter has. And I'm glad to say I know you.
Well, that's very kind of you, Richard. Now, maybe the folks will think that I scratch your back, you scratch mine, but that's, I don't think I'm flattered to hear that. What I know, I do work hard. That's true. But, everybody has their own talents and what they can give to, what they are able to give, because we're all unique human beings. I mean, fascist states, statist governments don't want us to be unique. They want to take that uniqueness away from us and make us all look alike and smell alike and talk alike and think alike. But as unique human beings, we each have something different to offer, and so I do my best. That's true, and work hard. I'm more focused on the mining companies, and that has not been a good strategy over the last 4 or 5 years, because gold mining companies haven't done that well. But what you do in your letter is a very balanced approach to investing, I would have done much better. I'll tell my listeners right now, I would have done much better in your portfolio over the last 5 years than I have with mine. So we'll let people know. But that's not to say we're not ready for a bull market in gold stocks. I think we're getting close, and when that day comes, maybe I'll do. I know I'll do a lot better. But in any event, well, let's talk about Richard Maybury now and stop about this nonsense from the host. You were, I believe, in the military during the Vietnam days. Is that right?
That's right. I was not stationed in Vietnam. I flew in and out. I was stationed in Central America and was involved in the various wars that Washington was participating in then. You may remember Che Guevara and other names from that era. So I was in that part of the conflict, and most Americans don't even know it existed.
Well, what America participated in, to what extent do you think we might have sort of stimulated those wars?
Oh, maybe close to 100%.
We've had... go ahead.
Yeah, the U.S. government just sticks its nose into the business of everybody in the world, and it's been doing it for more than 100 years. And Central America and South America were the first places. Well, not the very first, but the favorite place that Washington meddled for many, many decades. I was part of that, and it was a shameful thing. I really am ashamed of having been involved in it, but I was young and I didn't know anything about real politics at that time, so I just did what they told me to do, and those were terrible things that I did.
Well, the point is, though, that you learn from it, and I think most people probably turn a blind eye to it, and or put some sort of a spin on it and try to make believe that. Or they drink the Kool-Aid that is given to them by our government that tells us that that we're doing that you're fighting and defending America or providing some sort of higher calling, right? The Constitution, all that. And I guess if people really understood that our government doesn't follow the Constitution anymore, then that would be nonsense. But in any event, let's get on to some of the topics. I wanted to ask you about Vietnam. We've been talking to James Perloff. He's been a fairly regular guest on this show, and he's written a very excellent book. But he was pointing out that with respect to the Vietnam War, that the president Lyndon Johnson or the Secretary of Defense, whoever was calling the shots, were not really allowing our troops, our soldiers, to win. In fact, he talked about the Ho Chi Minh Trail, where we weren't allowed to bomb anybody, any of the Viet Cong that were off to the side of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. He said they would know that the bombers were coming from the radar, and they would just scatter off to the sides. But the command was not to try to kill them when they went off to the side. Likewise, they were the MiG fighters, according to James. We were not allowed to shoot the MiGs if they were on the ground. Only if they started scrambling in the air were we allowed to fire at them. Well, I mean, what sense does that make? And why would we? I don't know, first of all, if that rings true to you, if what James was saying makes sense to you about Vietnam. But why, if it does, then why would we get involved in a war and then design it so that we couldn't win it?
Now regarding the MiGs, that specific case, I don't know anything about, but I'm sure it probably is true, because there were numerous cases of that sort of insanity going on, where the American troops would be told to take a hill, let's say, and they'd take a bunch of casualties. A lot of guys would get killed. They'd take the hill, and 3 days later they'd be told to abandon the hill and go somewhere else. And the enemy would then just take over the hill again. There are lots of things like that. And, what was some big part of what was going on was that McNamara and a lot of other people who thought they were more brilliant than the rest of the world thought that the way you win that kind of a war, a guerrilla war, is just by hurting the enemy and showing him that he can't win. And that was the overall strategy, is always show the enemy he can't win, and then he will eventually give up. Well, the thing that actually happened is the enemy realized that they had a lot more sticking power than Washington did, and if they just kept fighting, Washington would eventually figure out that it couldn't win, and it would go away, which is what happened. The funny thing is, what most Americans don't know, is that the U.S. won every major battle over there. There were a few small ones they didn't, but they won every major battle, but they still lost the war because the enemy just lasted longer. and this goes back to the main thing is wrong with all of American foreign policy, is that those fools in Washington do not try to see things from the other side's point of view. They always think they're smarter and they know how to win. And they go into these things without knowing the history of those other people. Well, the Vietnamese have been fighting off the Chinese and other people for many centuries. And they were really, really good at guerrilla war. And what they were really the best at was perseverance. There's probably never been an army in the history of the world that had the perseverance of the Vietnamese, and they just hung in there longer than Washington did. And anybody who knew their history knew that was what was going to happen, but Washington wouldn't pay attention. They believed that their superior firepower would win the war for them as long as they kept showing the other side that the other side couldn't win. And as they say, the U.S. won every major battle, but it didn't do any good.
That's incredible. Well, of course, we had during the Vietnam War, we had the college protests. When we had a draft, Richard. I'm wondering if maybe one of the wisest things that our military-industrial complex did was drop the draft, because now, people don't care so much. I think people don't care so much. And also you have a horrible economy, so what are people going to do? They go off to the military. It's the only place they can find a job.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering to what extent, though, we might have lasted longer if we hadn't had a draft during Vietnam.
Yeah, they would have lasted longer. I think there's no doubt about that. But nevertheless, I don't think Americans will ever have the kind of patience that the Vietnamese did, and probably still do. When you study that war and you look at the strategies and tactics, especially the tunneling that the enemy did, I mean, my God, tunnels would go on for miles and miles underground, and clearing those tunnels out was pretty close to impossible. And those tunnels had been built for who knows how many years they'd been building those tunnels. It's that sort of a thing. I mean, these people, well, and this brings up another point that Americans don't seem to understand, is when America invades somebody else's country and goes to war there, the Americans are the invaders.
Yes.
Well, how would you feel about it if somebody came into our country and told us, we're going to clean this place up for you, we're going to make it better, you're just going to have to follow our rules for a while, but things will be wonderful. Americans would not buy that. They would fight.
You better believe it.
You would see these invaders as a threat to your home and family, and you would fight like a tiger. And that's what happens all over the world. When U.S. troops go in someplace, they are invaders, and those people feel that their families are threatened, and they fight like tigers to throw us out. And that's what the main part of the Vietnam War was about, was simply the Vietnamese attempt to throw the invaders out.
Yeah. Well, we're everywhere now. We're probably more. We probably expanded our military presence even more since Vietnam. It's not as if that was a setback for the Anglo-American, or let's say for Washington. But you point out in your recent letter, the one that just came out, that as insane as the Vietnam War was, you noted that what we're doing now in the Middle East is even crazier. Would you care to elaborate a little bit on that? What are we doing there now?
The fundamental thing that's going on in the Mideast is that area is returning to its natural condition, which is warfare. These people have been fighting each other, tribe against tribe, ethnic group against ethnic group, religion against religion. They've been fighting each other for a minimum of 13 centuries. The big overriding battle in all of this is the Sunnis versus the Shiites. That's been going on for 13 centuries, and the U.S. is in it now on both sides. Washington takes sides with various groups on both sides of that ancient battle. So you have, in one battlefield, you might have the 82nd Airborne trying to kill Sunnis, and on some other battlefield, the 101st Airborne is trying to kill Shiites. They're fighting on both sides of this war, and it's just more insane even than Vietnam was.
Well, it seems to be, Richard, but I mean, maybe it's not insane for the guys that are making the military, all of the military hardware.
Well, yeah, I've heard that argument before. And
what drives it? I mean, what's driving the craziness? That's what I'm
asking.
I
think the thrill of using power is what drives all wars. I don't think there's an exception. And especially in the U.S. case for the last 200 years. The U.S. politician is a politician like anybody else in the world. He wants power. He wants to reorder the world according to his plan. And he wants that political power to do it. Political power is the privilege of using brute force on persons who haven't harmed anyone. That's the fundamental overriding driving force in all of politics, is this desire for the privilege of using brute force on people who haven't harmed anyone so that you can reorder the world in some way. Well, the U.S. politician is no different than politicians everywhere. He's got that desire for that power, And when he gets it, he wants to use it on somebody. And the most satisfying use of power is military force. That's the ultimate in political power. And I think they just get suckered into one war after another by their own desire for power. They cannot resist the temptation. And the American founders understood this. So there's all kinds of writing from that time where people like James Madison and John Jay would write about how the corrupting effects of power and how power destroys a person's judgment. Political power corrupts. Everybody knows that line. It's a cliche, but the reason it became a cliche is because it's true. Political power corrupts the morals and the judgment. And to me, that is what drives the U.S. involvement in every war that's ever happened except the American Revolution. And if I had it to do over again, knowing what I know about all of America's wars, the only one I would volunteer for is the Revolution in 1776. The rest of them were all put-up jobs where some U.S. politician wanted the glory of war, and he found excuses to get into it.
Yeah.
Every one of them, including...
Yeah, indeed, and that matches what James Perloff has been telling us about the last 6 wars. There have been, false flags that were used in one way or another to rally the American people behind those wars. So it's it's incredible. But, speaking of power, this is a question I hadn't thought about asking you, Richard, but, this love of power, this thirst for power, something I read, and you can tell me whether you've read the same thing or whether you believe it's true. But reportedly there were some generals that didn't think it was necessary that we had to use the nuclear weapons against Japan to finish off the Second World War. But in fact, we used it. At least one idea was that we used it to let everybody know who was in charge going forward into the future. Does that sound far-fetched to you?
Well, yeah, that's in my book about World War II.
Oh, maybe that's where I read it. That's probably where I read it.
Well, if you read it there, then I agree with it.
Well, okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, I don't know about generals. I can't speak off the top of my head about what any generals thought about using the nuclear weapons, but I know that the Navy generally thought it was insane. There was absolutely no military reason to use those bombs because Japan is an island nation with almost no natural resources to speak of, and Japan was completely cut off from the rest of the world by 1945. It was sealed off like the whole country had put in a vacuum-packed coffee can and had been just completely cut off from the rest of the world, and it was headed back for the Stone Age because they had no way to really support a modern economy. The Navy had them entirely surrounded, and their Air Force was pretty much wiped out too, and their Navy had been sunk. So the Navy and the U.S. Navy, are saying, why did you do this? There was no reason for any more fighting. We could just sit here and wait until they either gave up or actually did return to the Stone Age. But Washington went ahead and did it anyhow, and I am convinced the reason was that they were trying to intimidate the Russians. They were not on good terms with Stalin, and I think that the use of the bombs, those 2 bombs in Japan, were demonstrations of the fact that the U.S. politicians were willing to wipe out cities in order to impose their rule on the world, and that they were saying to Stalin, you better clean up your act and do things the way we want, or else we've got these bombs. Well, what happened was that the Russian people were rising up at that time against Stalin, the way they did in the early 90s. They were doing that in 1945. They were starting to overthrow Stalin, and when the U.S. used those bombs, that rebellion just went away because, well, not completely, but it lasted another 5 years and it was gone. And what happened was, as far as we can tell, the Russian people said, oh my God, the only thing that's protecting us against those bombs is Stalin. So we can't get rid of Stalin anymore. We need him now to protect us against the Americans.
Wow.
And that's what happened, that Stalin was actually held in power by those bombs. It was exactly the opposite reaction that Washington was trying to achieve.
Well, that's fascinating. So much more to talk about. My engineer is telling me we only have 4 minutes. I can't believe it. But, Richard, we are bankrupting, it seems to me. I mean, we're bankrupting our country. I mean, we talked a little bit earlier on this show today about the debt markets that seemingly may be coming out of control of the central banks, both the German Bund as well as the U.S. Treasury now breaking through some key levels. Michael Oliver suggesting a little earlier on this show today that he thinks that the long 30-year bull market in the bond market and the U.S. Treasury market is probably over. And that we could be on to some very rocky times ahead. How do you see it?
Yeah, I think rocky times ahead is a good way of describing it. You and I have talked about this a lot. There is so much. I mean, for one reason, this is one reason why there is so much malinvestment when the federal government injects money into the economy, when it changes taxes, when it does any number of things that it does. It rearranges the flows of money in the country. In fact, that's the main reason they do these things, is to rearrange the flows of money. So businesses that were dependent on a given flow of money suddenly find the flow dries up. The money went somewhere else, and these businesses go under. And those businesses that are dependent on these artificial flows of money from Washington are not investment. They are malinvestment. They are mistakes that government causes by manipulating flows of money. And every time the government changes the flows, then some of this malinvestment comes to light because these companies now are going under. And that's essentially what we're up against. I believe the amount of malinvestment out in the United States today is not calculable. It is so huge, and it's so difficult to recognize. We don't really know how much is there, but we do know the government has been changing flows of money routinely year after year for so many decades that the level of malinvestment must be just absolutely incredible. And when finally this whole Ponzi scheme that they're running in Washington falls apart, then all that malinvestment is going to come to the surface at once, and you got a depression, and who knows how they're going to react to that. Probably.
Okay, Richard. Unfortunately, we're out of time. But tell our listeners. I wanted to ask you about money velocity. The notion is that when money starts to turn over, we're going to head into some very high inflationary days, probably when the dollar loses its value. What are you telling your listener? What are you telling your subscribers they should own? Just real quickly, what sort of things should they own? Besides defense stocks, we talked about that last time. Yeah, right.
Well, I was listening to your previous show right before me, and I agree with everything you guys said. I think that gold and silver, platinum, palladium, those are the key things to own, and I think that we will look back on these days and regard them as dirt cheap right now. This is one of the great buying opportunities in history, I think.
All right, I think you're right. I was just tell my listeners, go to Richard's newsletter. There's so much more we didn't get to talk about. The Baltic powder keg, dollar velocity, huge numbers of very important topics. Go to Richard's newsletter, please, and subscribe. We're out of time. I'm sorry, Richard. We'll have you back again sometime real soon. Thank you very much for being with us today.